Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. We're staying home today. We are joined by Andrea Carson, who we've had on the show before, actually a long time ago, maybe episode like 4 or 5. Andrea is an associate professor in journalism and a political scientist at my alma mater, the great Trobe University, nestled up in Bundoora in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Hello to anyone who is a La Trobe University student, and hello to everyone at Glen College. So Andrea is on today to talk about media and the media landscape, and we're going to pay particular attention to the media landscape and its relationship with politics, both in the United States and also back home here in Australia. And it's really an opportunity for me to have a rant about how journalists currently give me the shits. So that's today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on your favourite podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon and Stitcher. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, please give us a rating and leave us a review. And for all the latest updates about the podcast, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. So let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Friday morning in glorious Melbourne, and joining me on the line from my alma mater, La Trobe University, is Andrea Carson, Associate Professor in Journalism and Political Scientist. Andrea, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thank you, Stephen. I can't believe you've asked me back. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, I was thinking when we were doing our production meeting, I guess you would call it, to work out who was going to be our guests sort of in the early part of the year. And I just wanted to do an episode where I got to beat up on journalists, and I needed someone who'd be prepared to listen to me rant and rave about how the journalists in Australia annoy me profusely over the course of the pandemic. I thought, Andrea will be up for that for sure. And she'll push back on me as well, so we'll have a good debate. So that's half the reason why. But so much has been happening in the world of media and politics and how they collide, in the last 4 years during the Trump administration, but particularly more so in the most recent, last 12 months. I just think it's worthwhile just checking in with you and getting a sense from you about, how you think this is all working. Because I'm actually searching for answers in a lot of these questions that I've got for you today, and I'm looking forward to your insight.
Great. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion.
Very good. Well, here we go. Eyes down for full house. Let's start over the US. I thought we'd talk about US politics and media and Trumpism, and then let's bring it home to Australia and talk about the relationship that exists between the media and politics here. And then I'm sure throughout it we're going to have to talk about social media and its role in political discourse. But let's start with Trump. And I just think it was the whole Trump era, hopefully, touch wood, has now ended. But looking back, from the moment he made his announcement in 2016, or maybe it was 2015. Actually, no, it was 2015, my God. And his opening announcements, which was just a tirade of controversial and offensive statements, which attracted the media's attention in his primary campaign. I don't think anyone took Donald Trump seriously as a candidate in the Republican primary, but he just kept on saying so many incendiary statements that the media couldn't stop but follow him and go live to his press conferences and his rallies. Take us all the way through to the consequences of the last 4 years of the Trump presidency. What do you think? What level of responsibility should the media take in the rise of Donald Trump to becoming the president of the United States and leader of the free world?
Well, that's a pretty good summation of it. the media, to get straight to the answer, needs to take a lot of responsibility. So in 2015, you're quite right, I was at a political science conference with a whole group of top American political scientists, and everyone laughed off the prospect that Donald Trump was going to win the primaries. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't was he'd been in people's lounge rooms for 12 years, doing the Apprentice show, and had been a household name. And in politics, name association and branding is everything. Well, it's a lot of it, as you know, Stephen, if people can recognize who you are. So he already had that groundswell, even if the elites like academics and the media didn't want to acknowledge it. But the other thing was, Dana Milbank, who was at the Washington Post, we brought him out to Australia to do a couple of guest lectures in 2017. And he ruminated on this question then. You know, Trump had been elected. He'd obviously won the primaries, made it all the way through. And he took a lot of responsibility and said, as American media, we didn't take him seriously, and we jumped on all those sensational moments and saw it as humorous. And what that gave Trump is something that every politician desires, and that is earned media. And earned media, as you know, is a term for free media. You don't have to pay for political advertising. And Trump, you might remember during that campaign, was telling the media how he wasn't going to spend much on advertising, nor did he need to. Clinton well and truly outspent him because the press were giving him all that coverage for nothing. And they were talking about him in such a way as though what he was doing was folly. And that also cemented his base. It reinforced this idea that the liberal media in the US are elites that are rejecting Trump, who is our man, and in doing so, they're rejecting us. And I think that further amplified, and I know we're going to get to this, the really divisive polarization that is going on in American politics, but also going on in the American media.
And then fast forward to the final days of the Trump presidency, you found networks, liberal networks like MSNBC and CNN. I think it's remarkable that we now regard CNN as a liberal network, whereas I just thought they were just like a cable news network that reported the news. But evidently now, and the polarization of the news media in the US, they're seen as being left wing. Regularly not cover Trump rallies and speeches, or they would go to it at the start and then they would pull away. Too little, too late, probably. But having said that, and in fact, going further than that, like on election night, so that was, I think that was Thursday morning Melbourne time. Trump gets up in the White House and then delivers a speech about how the election's rigged. He actually won. He won in a landslide, and it's been a fraudulent election. And as he begins, I don't think any of the major networks cover it. Even Fox News's Sam Shepard Smith, gave us a disclaimer saying what you're hearing from the president right now is largely untrue. My question to you is, are they, in censoring the president, they're denying him his free speech? How do you get the balance right? Because if I was a rusted on Republican, I'd be pretty pissed about that. Whether you agree with him or not, is up to you. But he is the president of the United States. He is a democratically elected leader. You should be covering what he says. Like, where does this balance lie for editors in media in the United States?
Well, you're right. There's the conundrum. You've got this constant tension going on in any democracy between having responsible speech, free speech, but in brackets responsible. We don't have an unfettered right to radical free speech that incites violence. And on the other hand, you've also got to guard against government overreach or political overreach and have space in between. And I think what you're describing shows how the media have not handled this question very well and the horse is bolted. So at one point, the platforms had this policy that misinformation and disinformation, by definition, a politician wasn't capable of doing that because it couldn't be inauthentic behaviour. If a politician chooses to say something, then that's a politician's legitimate viewpoint, even if it's factually incorrect. They had to revise their thinking on that policy during the last election campaign because there was the realisation that misinformation can also cause real life harm through the incitement of violence, which is what we've seen in other countries that aren't democracies, such as Myanmar. But we've also seen it with the amplification of the problems of COVID-19 misinformation, that people might share remedies with each other and spread this stuff thinking that they're helping out friends and family. But if it's false, it can actually lead to real life harm. And so the platforms, not just social media, but also what you're describing, mainstream media, have been trying to grapple with this on the run and not doing a particularly good job of it, because finding that sweet spot between those tensions in a democracy is really difficult. And the other layer to put on top of this is think tanks like Freedom House have been charting the state of democracy in the world for the last 20 or so years. And they have found a profound decline by both liberal democracies and illiberal states in political and civil freedoms and media rights. The last 15 years that's been tracking down, and part of this is 9/11, the reaction that we had to that, with lots of extra surveillance laws and things in place that stifled media free speech. So in this environment where you've got a global assault on democratic freedoms, and then you go and censor someone like Donald Trump, you can see how that also further inflames, as you say. If you're a Republican, you'd be pretty pissed by that. It feeds into the conspiracy theories that that Republicans are not being heard, and it also further increases this polarization.
If you did a do-over and you had a time machine, you go back to 2016, and you're a journalist sitting in the press room with, was it Sean Spicer back then, or with Donald Trump, or even during the campaign itself, or if you're a news editor, how would you deal with Trump knowing what happened in the end? How would you try and maintain some level of fact and truth being reported by your news agency, but at the same time enabling a politician a platform to communicate to the audience that they're seeking to communicate for election purposes?
Well, embedded in that question is something that I think we're going to get to, and that is Trump a cause or a symptom? And I think Trump's a symptom. And if you've got that time machine, I'd probably take it back even further than 2016, and I'd take it back to the whole 24-hour news cycle and the business model which we saw with Fox News, that sensational clickbaity information gets eyeballs, eyeballs deliver advertisers, advertisers deliver huge amounts of revenue. And what we saw during the 2020 election campaign was the number one broadcaster in the States was Fox News. It was beating the free-to-air stations, the commercial stations. It has an enormous audience. So I think Fox News has a lot to be responsible for there. And if I'm taking my time machine back, I think the seeds were sown a long time ago for this polarization we're seeing in the US media, and it's a really important lesson for Australia. One of the theories that political scientists look at is political selective exposure theory. And that is the idea that if you're a Trump supporter, you're only going to consume right-wing media. If you're a Clinton or a Biden supporter, you're only going to consume liberal media. And you don't get any cross-pollination. What some studies have found is that what can mitigate against that cross-pollination is a public broadcaster, which fortunately Canada has, Australia has, the UK has, which can just allow a bit more hybridization of the types of media that we consume. Now, I've found this firsthand. We worked with the United States Studies Centre and with the University of Melbourne during the last year to see what effects COVID-19 was having on media consumption. And we ran surveys during the peak of the pandemic in March and September in the US and in Australia. And what we saw was pretty alarming, that you get these two peaks in the distribution of media consumption in the US. You get exactly that those who are conservative only consume conservative media. Those that are Democrat supporters only consume liberal media. That includes your CNN. In Australia, we see a lot more heterogeneity and we see that if people are nominating their top 5 news choices, there's a bit of Murdoch press in there, there's the ABC, there might be the Guardian or the Age. Within the course of a week, they're relying on different media sources and therefore getting a lot more in their news diet. It's a better news diet, it's more mixed, it's more varied. In the US, I don't know how you unscramble that egg and get people out of their filter bubbles and start to be able to consume media that doesn't just reinforce their already self-established viewpoints about politics.
I mean, that's a really interesting point you've made there. I have a sarcastic question to ask you here, and I do want to pick up on this later. You're right. In Australia, some of us don't have that because, I guess it makes sense for conservatives to consume Murdoch news. It makes sense for Greens to consume The Guardian. Where do us Labor people get our news from? Where can we consume our news? Because there isn't really a outwardly Labor media source in our country. Some people may think it's Fairfax. I don't think it is at all. I think that's changing a lot. And that's the frustration I have, is it almost feels like clowns to the left and me jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you without something to read or watch on television. And I long for that in some way. I know what you're talking about, that in the United States it's shit because it is so polarised. I do get my fix. I love watching MSNBC at lunchtime. I just pop down there and watch a bit of Rachel Maddows and have a sandwich and just love watching what's going on there. I know it's not great for our democracy, but and here comes the rant. This is what I found so frustrating during the COVID, particularly as a Victorian, particularly as a Labor Party Victorian and supporter of Daniel Andrews and his government and the work that they're doing, was that the conservative media were absolutely piling in on him. And the non-conservative media, but they are not Labor media, were absolutely piling in on him. Now, that's probably good for democracy, but as a consumer of news, I wanted some fair and balanced reporting, and I was finding it hard to find it. And interestingly now, in 2020, because of social media and because of platforms like Twitter, we all get to rant and vent about it. And for the first time in a long time, journalists are being held to account for their reporting, and they're cracking the shits about all of a sudden being accountable. Because when they did their course at RMIT, I don't think the lecturer ever said, oh, you'll have to be accountable to your reporting. I think they thought, no, you're above the fray. You're just reporting about what's going on. And you're not a part of the system and the industry. And I've had arguments about journalists when I worked for the party. I said, you are a part of the industry. As much as I'm a part of the industry, I'm trying to get elected. You're trying to sell copy. We're all in this big world. Don't think that you're above this. And I think that journalists in Australia are being caught up in this, and they're feeling the wrath of certainly Labor people. I'm sure they're feeling the wrath of Tories as well, because they're probably thinking the ABC is the mouthpiece for the Labor government, but I don't think that's the case. And I agree with you. We need an independent free media like the BBC, like the ABC, like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Clearly, there needs to be more funding in the United States to PBS, a very fine channel. But at the same time, I'm wanting a bit of that compartmentalization of media. I want to be able to. That's half the reason why I set up this podcast, because there's no voice for us, And God bless you for coming on the show, because I know you're not a Labor person, but there's no voice for us. There's no one, calling bullshit on these journalists that are having a pot shot at our premier, who I think is doing a very, very good job under trying circumstances. End of rant. Back to you, Andrea.
Wow, you've given me a lot to sort of mull through there. The first thing I would say is your observation is correct. And when I talk about the really severe polarization in the US, there is a lesson for Australia, because we do see those patterns in Australia as well. They're just not as extreme. We do see that you've got your right-leaning Murdoch press, which has enormous reach in Australia because of very concentrated media ownership. And what we did with this last study I was talking about before is we looked at the media ecology across Australia and across the US, and we gave it a score. We asked people their top 5 media that they consumed, and we worked out overall where the media landscape was. And believe it or not, Australia was slightly more right-wing overall than the US. And part of this is because of the dominance of the Murdoch newspapers and Fox, Sky, the equivalent of Fox, but with a smaller audience in Australia. And part of that is we have what is known as a low choice media environment compared to the US, where you can go to a lot more outlets to get your fix. But as you say, that's been broadened by having the opportunity to go outside our geographical boundaries and consume media that is, in London or in any of the major capital cities of the world, whether it's New York Times, or you can go and get other media. But if we want Melburnian news or local news, we're pretty limited, aren't we? Beyond finding podcasts like this one. So we have a pretty low choice media environment. The observation you made about Daniel Andrews and the way that journalists were held to account is a really interesting period of time, I think, because what we found with our study is there was really high engagement with news. People had been news avoiders up until the pandemic. People were being turned off news. They'd had enough. They were sick of maybe the polarization or hearing the same old stuff. But with the pandemic, people really got turned on to the news. This happened in the US as well as Australia. And it didn't matter which side of politics you're on. And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because we all want to know what's going on. This thing affects us directly. It's not an election issue that we worry about during an election campaign. We need to be across it. We need to know what the rules are. And what we got to see with Daniel Andrews was those daily press conferences, which were broadcast on ABC 24. But we also got to see the journalists at play. We got to see how the sausage was made. Normally, the public doesn't get to see that. And as a former journalist myself, someone who asks those impertinent questions, which I'm sure you're not against doing yourself, Stephen, the public gets to see that and sees what they perceive as a degree of incivility in the way that journalists are interacting with the Premier of the country. And what we also found between the March survey and the September survey is that trust in Australia was really high compared to the US. Overall, we had great trust in the political response. We loved the fact that overwhelmingly that our politicians were taking seriously social distancing and lockdowns. 2/3 were supportive. In the US, only 1/3, regardless of partisanship. And once you bring partisanship in, it even pulls apart further. But part of what we also saw by the September survey is trust fell only in one area in Australia, and that was for journalists. And I think that's because they got to see how the sausage was made. They didn't like the incivility, and it started, there was an awakening about what this media game was all about. Now, I might have a slightly different point of view to you where you're pretty critical of that. I actually think that robustness between the exchange of Daniel Andrews and the journalists is a good thing, but how it ends up, once you've had that initial exchange, how it ends up in the more thoughtful commentary or the article that appears afterwards, that's where you hold the journalist to account. And we have seen some rabbit commentary, but let's keep it in proportion. Overall, we've still had pretty responsible messaging coming out of our media compared to what you've seen in the US. Largely the media, with a couple of polemic exceptions, such as Sky News, which has a very small audience. Overall, we've seen a repeat of the medical expertise. We haven't seen contradictions of medical expertise like we've seen in the US, with Donald Trump outright contradicting Fauci and the media saying that this pandemic is a Democrat hoax. We haven't seen any of that. And we should be thankful of that. Because of that unity, we've been able to have a relatively unified political response, and we've had great public compliance. And that says something about a virtuous circle that's been created where public policy is able to be enacted. We haven't seen that in the US, where there's been a vicious circle and you've had disparate viewpoints and the public doesn't know what to think.
Can I push back on that? I mean, I agree with your sentiment, broadly speaking there. I think that America is a very low bar. It's a terrible example. And I think if we in Australia ever get to that stage, then we're in dire straits. However, the performance of people like Peter Credlin, Alan Jones, and that whole Sky News crew going after scientific consensus and decrying the Victorian pandemic response as draconian, I thought was getting close to that reporting model that had been adopted by the right-wing media in the United States. And I thought that the tone of some of the coverage, I can only go by the Herald Sun here, I don't read other Murdoch press outside of this state, but Sky News and the Herald Sun's reporting of of the Andrews government's response to it. And I mean, I think that from day one, the tone of the government's response is everything we're doing is dictated to us by the science and our scientists within the Department of Health. So these are not political decisions that we're making; these are scientific decisions that we're making, and we're just communicating them to you. There was a tone coming from the right-wing media in this country that I felt was undermining that scientific argument. So I think it's the start. It might not be as bad as what it was like in the United States, where Donald Trump's talking about shoving torches down your guts and drinking hydrochloroquine or whatever the hell it's called. But it was kind of getting there. And I think that, I don't know why they changed their tone, or they toned it down, what the reason was. Maybe it was because there was a backlash in the community, and they went, maybe the editor went, okay, let's pull back on that. We're not going to be able to get away with that too much. I don't know, but it certainly went there. And Sky in particular is pretty bad on this stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're right, but there's a couple of really stark differences. One is that Sky has low audience numbers in Australia. It's not like Fox News, which is the number one broadcaster. However, there's a caveat on that, and it's something we should all be aware of and perhaps a little alarmed by, and that is during the 2019 federal Australian election campaign, Sky News programming went free to air in 36 or so different regions of broadcasting regions across Australia, really predominant in New South Wales and Queensland. And so now some of that rhetoric and polemic, unhelpful information that you've described is now available on free-to-air networks. And I think we need to really watch what happens in those electorates to see whether there's an actual experiment going on here, that infusion of these very partisan media conversations, whether that's going to change the colour of some of those electorates moving forward. And that's an area I've certainly earmarked for further studies. But I know you want to jump in. The only other thing I would say is public sentiment is not with those polemic comments. Even when Victoria had the second wave and the rest of Australia did not, we were mapping public sentiment throughout that period. Yes, Daniel Andrews lost some political bark, but still the majority of Victorians were on board. And still, Daniel Andrews was getting a higher public trust measure than what the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was. So people might be, even if they're exposed to that, and I'm arguing that most people aren't, even if they are hearing some of that unhelpful information, they're still valuing the fact that the Premier was putting the health response first over an economic response.
Okay. So to pick up the first point, I completely agree with you. When that decision was made that Sky News was going, I'm with you. Sky News, it's community TV for people that work in Canberra, in Parliament, basically. However, when they did move into free media markets in regional Australia, that's when I was like, oh, okay, this is smart by Murdoch doing this. This is kind of like, if you think about where is the Republican heartland in the United States, who's watching Fox the most? It's people in the rural areas. That people in urban parts of the United States are not watching Fox News. It's the outer suburbs and it's in the rural areas. Where are the strongest parts of the Republican base? It's in the outer suburbs and it's in the rural areas. Maybe the outer suburbs is probably up for debate at the moment, and that's probably where elections have won and lost. But yes, that was a worry for me, and it's still a worry for me, and I would like to see that changed. If I had a magic wand, I would wave that wand and say, Shazam, no one's watching Sky News anymore for free in the region. So that study that you're doing there, or the research you're doing there, I'll be very intrigued to see the ongoing results of that going forward. Your second point, which was, remind me again. Oh, yes.
Public sentiment is still on the side of the Victorian Premier.
I think that's just because...
Despite all the criticism.
I know, but I just think that's because Daniel's a shit-hot leader. Like, if he was a dunce, he'd get crucified by the media.
Yep, but doesn't that show the public are not fools? They see that and they're responding in a way that reflects their appreciation that the science is being put forward first and that there is a health response. And I'll tell you another interesting thing. Often older people tend to vote conservatively, What we found in some of our research during this time is older people were some of the biggest fans of Daniel Andrews. And that is because they were really concerned about their health, and they were very appreciative that they had a premier who was prioritising that. So you might see, depending on, politics can be a week, can be a year in politics, of course, so things could change. But you might see some of those demographic movements change with the older Conservative vote actually going more towards Labor at the next election.
I think everyone's going towards Labor the next election. That's how bad the opposition is right now. But
well, you would say that.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. Like you should run for Brighton. You'll probably be a Labor MP. Okay, here's the difference. In the normal state of play, the way that we consume our media or the way that we hear from our politicians is directly through the media, either them doing a doorstop, like a stand-up on the news at night, or articles written about them in the newspapers, or maybe hearing them on radio. And obviously there's the direct sort of link between their communication on their social media platforms to the electorate. The difference during the COVID response, or the second lockdown, was Daniel did 150 press conferences every morning directly to the people of Victoria. And we all heard the dickhead questions from some journalists. I'm not going to completely blame all journalists for being dickheads, but some journalists. So it was a different period for people to come to a conclusion about, trust, leadership, media. But, Daniel doesn't get up as much as he used to. In fact, very rarely. I think he's getting up today for the first time in a while. So it's kind of gone back to the status quo. I wonder if you were to... What I'm worried about from a political perspective as a campaigner is that... And yes, I also acknowledge that the influence of traditional earned media is in decline. But even still, whatever influence that they do have, the biases of, say, the Herald Sun can impact on an election outcome. Less so than, say, 10, 20 years ago, but still can. What I worry about is that there are editors now, in particularly in newspapers, but in Sky News, saying, okay, our remit now is we are basically the Tory rag for the Liberal Party. And that's all we're going to be now. Our business model is not even going to be trying to be fair and balanced. We might say we're fair and balanced, but we're not. And that concerns me for journalism, because that's the start of polarisation, because all it takes is for one other organisation to say, well, fine, if you're going to capture the right-wing consumer market, then we'll do the left-wing consumer market. And then we move down that path of what we have in the United States.
Well, I don't disagree with that. And as I made the point before, we are seeing patterns of polarisation. And you did make the point that the US is a low bar. I concede that too. And I'm thankful we don't have that degree of polarisation. But yes, you're right. The seeds are there. We have those patterns that are starting to appear. But the elephant in the room here that we haven't spoken about so much is the ABC. And that those free-to-air press conferences were through the ABC. And the ABC also has, in the ABC Act, a commitment that it must give fair and balanced reporting, and that it must make corrections if it gets something wrong. And you said before, where's the space for people like you to consume media? Well, I would argue the ABC is probably a space there, because you are meant to be getting impartial information. And we do have research from across the globe that shows public broadcasters that are taxpayer funded do mitigate against polarisation. And I think this is an argument that is that needs to be prosecuted more than ever, that we need adequate funding for the ABC. We can't allow its funding to deteriorate, especially as we're entering into this more polarised environment, because that is where we should be getting away from the political agendas that we see play out in some of the media that you have named. But I will also pick up the point that you made about your recognition that earned media has lost some of its power. Absolutely it has. Compared to the 20th century, where there was enormous cultural capital of the traditional mastheads, where they had a monopoly on advertising, and what came through in those newspapers were incredibly powerful. Murdoch recognises that, which is why he's so keen to go after the digital platforms. They're the new tycoons, they're the new monoliths. And it's no coincidence that when we're looking at this new bargaining code that the ACCC's put forward, that the government's determined to legislate on, that there's an invisible hand of Murdoch in that space to make sure that some of that money that goes to the digital platforms comes back to his publications. Now, I'm not just saying this is conspiracy theory. The Saturday paper did an in-depth investigation looking at the lobbying efforts of News Corp execs up in Parliament, up in the Capitol, during the formation of that bargaining code. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, but as a principle, it might be okay. But the way that policy has been constructed has some serious flaws. And while it's not popular to be on the side of the digital platforms, I can see why they have some concerns about the way that policy has been formulated.
Yeah, okay, let's go there because I'm really interested to get your thoughts on this sort of Murdoch versus new media. It's kind of like watching England versus South Africa in rugby. I don't have a team. I don't know who I want to win. I'm kind of going for the referee. I'm going for the referee, I guess. Where's the way forward on this one? Because, okay, can we start first of all with the deplatforming of Trump? How do you feel about that? If you were the head of Twitter, would you have deplatformed Trump?
It's a great question. I guess as a starting principle, free speech is really important, but the platforms had to change their viewpoint when they could see the misinformation that he was promulgating was causing real world harm. And we're seeing that now play out with the impeachment proceedings in the US about just exactly what Trump did and did he incite violence. They have a responsibility then. It's their platform, it's their medium. Do they want to be responsible for other people's deaths? But do you take him down permanently? That's the question for me. Or do you just do it temporarily? I'm not quite sure of the answer to that. But I do think there needs to be a greater recognition from the platforms that they need to do more. And I was pleased to see at that point in time that they were prepared to review their policies and recognise that there was imminent harm that was coming at that point in time and that they had to change their policies. That level of reflexivity, I think, was important at that time. I don't know. What do you think?
I liken it to when I was a young union organizer for the SDA, Disney stores were shutting down and they were all in the major shopping centres. And we went to go protest out the front of them because they weren't paying the appropriate redundancies in the award. So we all dressed up in Mickey Mouse costumes and said that they were handing out Mickey Mouse redundancies.
Nice.
Thank you. Now, it all went well until we went to Southland, Westfield Southland, in which the store manager there started to take umbrage with our protest, which was getting quite loud. And the security guards came and asked us to leave. And I said, I wouldn't leave unless the police asked me to leave. They said, no, this is private property. You can't be on here. We can ask you to leave. I said, and I just decided to be a prick. And I said, no, I'm not going. So 6 people had to pick me up, dressed as Mickey Mouse, and drag me out of screaming and yelling like Dennis in Monty Python's Holy Grail, come and see the violence inherent in the system kind of scene, getting dragged out of Southland, Westfield Southland. Now, I think back on that time, they had every right to drag me out of there. It was private property. Now, I have a right to protest, but it is private. In the end, it's private property. And that's what the police said to me. He said, Stephen, you can do it for as much as you like, but in the end, they can kick you out. And I feel like the same with Twitter. It's their property. We're on it. We can do whatever we like, but if we start to break the rules, then out you go. And I think that Donald Trump, I'm amazed that he stayed on there that long. Like, I was in that store for probably 20 minutes. Donald Trump was in that store for 4 years doing some of the most inappropriate things on that platform and never got kicked off. So, and I don't think he's the kind of character that's going to learn his lesson from it. Like, I kind of thought, I actually would have, if I was Twitter, just for a laugh, I would have let him on for like 12 hours just to see him, watch him just try and get his rants in as quickly as he possibly could and undo all the things. Maybe he did that press conference saying, I'm okay, life is normal, I don't agree with the protesters, yada, yada. He was reading a bloody auto cue and it had been written by someone else and he didn't agree with a word of it. I would have let him on a Twitter maybe 20 minutes after that and watched me going, I didn't agree with any of that, that was garbage. Like, I just think he's insane and I wouldn't bring him back on again. There are my thoughts.
Yeah, well, you make a good point because they do have community standards And if they're going to be meaningful, they need to live by them and they need to enforce them regardless of who's breaching those community standards. And the old excuse that politicians were somehow exempt, I'm glad to see that that policy has been rewritten, especially if it does lead to real world harm.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's move to this debate between Murdoch and the social media platforms. You started to explain to me what they're trying to do here in Australia. Unpack that for me a bit, because I haven't really not been following this, so I'm new to this. Is it regulatory change or legislative change that they're seeking to do in terms of media laws?
Yeah. So there's a clear problem, and that is that traditional media has lost a lot of revenues, which has led to massive job losses and smaller newsrooms. And we all know that for a well-functioning democracy, you need to have diverse and plural opinions and the contest of ideas. It's nice to see a Liberal government standing up for that viewpoint, that we need to have diversity of viewpoints. Very late to the party, but they have decided that Australia is at risk of losing some of its media diversity. And that is, the problem is because I've lost the advertising revenues. Where have the advertising revenues gone? Digital platforms. Google, Facebook, super successful at gobbling up that advertising revenue because they have more sophisticated systems and they can target, they give advertisers what they want. They target directly to the person most likely to buy their stuff. So that's a pretty easy problem to understand. What's the solution? Well, the government's decided, well, let's just grab the money off the digital platforms and hand it back to mainstream media. Is that fair? What other business allows you to do that? Even if you really dislike the platforms, there's a question there. I'm not necessarily saying absolutely that's unfair, but we should think about it. But what I don't like about this legislation is not only are they saying that the media companies and the platforms, only two platforms, by the way, Twitter and TikTok and all those are not part of this legislation. It's only Google and Facebook. They must negotiate with the news companies about how much value their news stories are on the platforms and pay for that. Well, I don't mind people paying for what they use. I mean, that's a fair concept. The problem is, unlike other aspects of Liberal governments, they're allowing collective bargaining here. The news companies can come together and bargain as a collective against the Google and Facebook, and they have a 3-month period in which to do that. But here's the part that I think it becomes bad legislation, and that is it is binding arbitration. So after 3 months, if they can't agree, News Corp comes up with what they think the platform should give them, and they've been citing like $1 billion. The platforms might come back and say, well, we think the value exchange is $5, and an arbiter can only choose one or the other. There is a definite winner and a definite loser. There is no room for compromise, and it is binding, meaning there is no room for appeal. In a democratic system of government with reasonable judicial overview, how is that acceptable? The argument coming from the ACCC is, well, the cycle begins again in another 12 months and they'll get the chance to renegotiate in 12 months' time. But I'm wondering, Stephen, whether you can see any potential problems with that.
Yes, I can see a lot of problems with that. Okay, so what I find interesting about this is that, and you know, going to your remarks earlier about, one, the Liberal Party are late to the party on this, but two, there's the sort of the hidden hand of Murdoch now starting to realise that his business model here in Australia is being challenged by social media or those new media platforms. We've not really had a proper debate about how do we regulate this new media world, and had a good conversation about it. So if I was a legislator, if I was a Labor Party MP in the federal parliament, I'd be like, this is a Band-Aid reform that really is actually stumping up your mates in the Murdoch family. There needs to be actually a broader conversation about how we actually regulate Facebook, Twitter, all the social media platforms. But I don't even know where to start with that because it's such a new thing.
That's the thing, no one does. And this is world first legislation. So the rest of the world is just looking really closely. I'm regularly getting calls from CBC in Canada because they're looking now to do the same thing. So is the French government. And these are really difficult questions, but one of the other problems with it is the value exchange can only go one way in the legislation. It must be the digital platforms handing money over to the news companies, and all the traffic that they direct to the news companies. Actually, to be fair, there was an amendment in the last formation of the bill that now they can take that into account, but the money can only flow one way. So it might reduce the overall amount of money that goes from the digital platforms to the news companies. Perhaps that's a good thing. But this will create precedent, and that's why we're getting these great threats from Google and from Facebook that they're going to pull out of the Australian market. That would be a disaster, because if they take out news content on their sites, what are we left with?
I know we'll have to use Bing.
Well, that has 5% of the market, and I don't know if you've searched anything on that, but usually I don't get where I want to go. But the problem is, if you take news and credible information off Facebook and Google, you're left with a whole heap of swirling crap. And we just talked about the misinformation and disinformation problem. How hard is it then going to be for people to navigate that space if there's not even credible news sources? So that's a really undesirable, unintended consequence when you get to this brinkmanship because of a policy that hasn't been well enough thought through. The principles are right. You do need to have a diverse and well-funded media. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just critical about the way they're getting there at the moment, and maybe we need a bit more of a rethink about what that policy looks like.
Where are you on Kevin Rudd's petition for a royal commission into Murdoch? Is this just an attempt for Kevin to try and reinvent himself in the minds of the Labor heartland and faithful, or is there actually some bona fides to what he's trying to do and will potentially have some strategic benefit to improving our media landscape?
Probably both. I mean, all power to him. There needs to be a spotlight on what the Murdoch dominance of the media has done to the Australian media ecosystem since Murdoch's been so dominant. Everyone can remember those front pages during the 2013 election and the 2016 aimed at Rudd, which was, does this guy ever shut up? And then against Bill Shorten in the 2016 front page story called Bill Nocchio, with a picture of Pinocchio in the likeness of Bill and this long nose, and with the imputation that he tells lies. That's not news. That's commentary. What's that doing on the front page? We need to have a further investigation of that. Those values, that great American tradition of objective news coverage where you put the facts first and the opinions go on well-labelled pages that say opinion and analysis, that's gone in the modern way of journalism. You regularly see after the first, sometimes not even the first sentence, where the opinion is infused within the news story. So good on Kevin Rudd for drawing attention to that. It's a really big problem. Mind you, it's not just limited to the Murdoch press. Is there going to be a Royal Commission? Well, he got 500,000 signatures from what I last saw. I can't see how there'll ever be a Royal Commission. I'd like to be wrong, but at least he's putting the spotlight on it because it is a problem and it's something that we need to think about.
Turning to some research that you're doing at the moment in relation to media in Singapore and Indonesia, I think. I know you've actually been doing some media this morning on ABC. Interested to get your thoughts on the work that you're doing there.
So this is separate to what we just spoke about with the disinformation code. With the bargaining code about the value exchange of having platforms pay for content, news content. This is another piece of regulation that the government's looking at now, which is how do you deal with the rampant spread of fake news online? And they have asked the digital platforms, following an ACCC inquiry, which recommended this, that the digital platforms get together, and this is more expansive than what we were talking about before. It includes TikTok and Twitter and a lot of the smaller players coming together under their industry organisation, which is called Digi, and coming up with a voluntary code of practice against disinformation. That's going to be released probably this month, and they will be held to account for disinformation on their platforms. I think that's positive development. The work that I've done in Indonesia and Singapore is looking at an alternative approach, which is where governments haven't had a voluntary code like Europe has and like Australia's looking at. They've legislated and they've passed laws against fake news, which sounds great in principle, but in practice it's diabolical, because after interviewing journalists and academics and fact checkers and the platforms and civil rights groups, that law gets used to suppress political opponents and independent journalists. So to give you an example, in 2019, Singapore introduced their law, which is called POFMA. Most of that law gets enacted during an election campaign. They had one last year, and most of the charges against breaching fake news have been levied at journalists and political opponents. The other really surreptitious part about this is you get 10 days to appeal, and in the meantime, the content that you've put forward has been shut down. How long is a Singaporean election campaign? It's 10 days. So by the time you've appealed, the election's over. So you can see how it's a vehicle for suppression of political dissent. Obviously, Australia is not the same sort of polity as Singapore and Indonesia, where classed as liberal democracy. Those countries aren't. But this is a really strong argument not to legislate against fake news, but to find co-regulatory models to be able to deal with it, or voluntary models, which is what the EU has done. So the government's, I think, doing the right thing about addressing this. Only a handful of nations have put measures in place. The majority that have legislated are authoritarian regimes. It's not a surprise. You know, they see it as another arsenal in their toolkit to be able to suppress any opposition. So it's a really important debate for us to have. It's about to really kick off. We'll see what the platforms have put together, and hopefully it'll be overseen by ACMA, and ACMA will agree to what the code is, or there'll be some backwards and forwards, and we'll get a really robust code.
I think Singapore like to be referred to as not as an authoritarian regime, but as a benevolent dictatorship.
Well, we in political science call them an electoral autocracy.
Nice. Yeah, it's an interesting place. Okay, look, I think we're done. Unless you've got anything else you want to throw at me, I feel this has been a cathartic experience. I feel like I've got a lot off my chest.
Well, can I throw a question to you?
Please.
I won't ask you whether the impeachment should go ahead or not, because I think we'll end up with another 30 minutes. But what can you expect is from the Biden administration? Are we going to see the reparation and healing that's needed for that country, or do you think it's gone too far?
Oh, that's a good question. Since the inauguration, I've had a number of really good guests from the States on the show in the last couple of weeks, and we've kind of I've been asking them that. And a lot of their answers are reasonably positive in that respect. But I think structurally the United States is set up to continue along these divisive lines for a while, and that's my greatest worry. But if I was Biden, you know, they're not going to make the same mistakes as they did in 2008 and 2009 with the Obama administration, in which, you know, I remember Obama's campaign was all about, you know, we're not red states, we're not blue states, we're the United States, and about hands across the aisle and all of that unifying stuff. And they did that. They practiced what they preached, and the Republicans were pissing in their pockets for basically 2 years as they were trying to negotiate the Affordable Care Act. And certainly I've heard from, you know, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and other people within the Democratic Congressional Caucus saying, we're not going through that again. And I think they're speaking on behalf of the Biden administration. I don't think Joe and Kamala are going to wait around. I think they've basically got 2 years, because then there'll be midterms, and then they'll probably lose either the House or the Senate. So I think that they're just trying to cash in as much as they possibly can in terms of change, which I think will be divisive, because Fox News and the Republicans will go back into their communities and just absolutely bash the hell out of the Democrats and call them socialists and all that kind of stuff, and it'll bring people further and further apart. The only way I think that he can maybe overcome that is if he has a strong jobs message. I think America, from an infrastructure perspective, is in in a critical need of overhaul, their roads, their airports, their schools, their hospitals. I would have and I know he's got that Build Back Better program. I asked one of the guys on the show a couple of weeks ago, how is that just a campaign policy that will just disappear into the ether, or is it something they're going to really run on? He says he hopes it will. I hope it will, because I think that if people in the community see investment in their communities, both actually fixing things up but also creating jobs, that the middle class will sort of, not pay attention to all the noise that's coming from Republicans or from the media, the right-wing media, and go, okay, I'll give this guy a go. And then that will give him electoral success in the midterms. But if it's just divisive kind of policy that's kind of on the fringe, that's appealing to their base, the Democratic base, then I worry that the country will continue to go down this sort of, red states and blue states.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great answer. You can come on the show again.
Very rarely do I get a question thrown back at me, so I have to really think about that. I normally have like 6 months to work out the questions I'm going to ask you, but you threw me on the spot. Andrea, wonderful having you back on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
Do come back on again if you ever want to talk about media and the good work that you're doing at La Trobe.
Oh, thank you. And the good work you're doing at Dunn Street.
Well, we're just plugging away. We're just trying to make the world a better place. That's all.
All power to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Cheers.